Welcome back. I am John P. Today we are going to be talking about some watch brands that watch snobs love to hate. Yes, that's right. These are going to be some watch brands that I may personally really enjoy, and I think a lot of watch collectors that truly have a passion for the hobby may really enjoy some of these brands. But over time, some of these brands, as they've tried new things or they've kind of jumped into other categories of watches that maybe they were not in before, they may have rubbed some of the snobs the wrong way. Now, I don't want to be calling anyone necessarily a watch snob, but I would kind of consider that to be a person that might be stuck in certain ways of thinking from the yesteryears in regard to watches. Think the old world brands, think Patek Philippe, think, Cartier, think very simple, timeless, and classic, and maybe not considering some really great, interesting things that are happening in watches today. And in my opinion, that's unfortunate because there's so many cool, new, interesting, not only brands, but also models from older brands coming out. And I think there are less snobs as time goes on and more people are kind of introduced to how cool some of these things can be. But the reality is some of these snobs still exist out there, but I think it's only a matter of time before they are kind of attracted, or some of these watches that are coming out today appeal to them as well. So it's a very exciting time in watches. On the wrist today, Rolex Oyster Perpetual 39 OP39 Red Grape. I love this. I find this watch to be kind of my everyday wear, go anywhere, do anything kind of watch. And you can see I posted probably more than my other watches on my Instagram, The Real John P. So what brand are we going to start with? Some of you probably guessed it. It's Richard Mille. Now, I'm not saying at all that they make poor quality watches. In fact, quite the opposite. They do a lot of very interesting things, this brand. Some of their watch cases, in fact, are made out of very special materials or mixtures of special materials where they might have to actually break 10 or 11 of these cases in the process before they can get one case that actually sticks. Some of these materials are, in fact, so hard, so durable that the creation of it can go wrong or go awry, and they actually don't produce a solid case. So Richard Mille, very expensive brand. Most of the watches, in fact, all the watches selling for over retail. There might be some ladies' pieces or some diamond-studded pieces that occasionally go for under, but you get the picture. The stores, the boutiques are empty. This is a brand that are on the wrists of so many celebrities, and that's part of why some watch snobs really don't like it, right? It's kind of the hot thing, the trendy thing, the it thing, and that's always the opposite of what this quote-unquote watch snob is really attracted to, right? This is going to be the opposite of what you'd get from a factory plain Patek Philippe or something like that, which oftentimes attracts these types of collectors. And so Richard Mille is a new brand. It came out in about 2001 with the original Richard Mille watch, and in a sense, it has picked up quite considerably in the last 5 years. But the reality is, those that are really into the purity of watches generally shy away from this brand. Now, personally, I think they do some pretty cool things. I don't think that myself. It's not really the kind of watch that I like to wear. I like very simple, timeless, and classic, and I'm not sure that these designs and styles will be here 100 years from now, whereas something like a Rolex with this oyster case is very likely, because this has been, standing decades and decades and decades, nearly a century at this point. Very similar case style. So I'm not sure that style will be around, but that is generally why it's looked down upon. But it does have, once again, a lot of redeeming qualities for those that do like the intricacies behind watches and some of the more nuanced ways and production methods. So there's a little bit something for everyone, but it is looked down upon for those reasons by snobs. Next, we have Zenith. Now, many collectors are going to say, John, what are you talking about? Zenith is pretty well respected. They have the El Primero, the legendary movement. In fact, there are very few brands that are really known for their movement, but the El Primero really sets Zenith apart from the others, having that legendary chronograph movement and that kind of interesting story where the watchmaker dug up the old parts that were hidden in an attic or something like that. And kind of revitalize this movement and really the entire collection, right? You have the El Primero, which is the name of the movement, but also collections of the watches. And so those that are willing to kind of branch out away from kind of the purity of some of the watch collecting are going to say, hey, this one maybe not so much. There are some watch snobs that have gotten onto Zenith, but a lot haven't, and especially those that have been collecting watches for quite a long time. And this is going to be because between the 80s and the 90s, Zenith kind of made some interesting choices. Some of the quality was maybe watered down a little bit compared to their standards today, for sure. They used some gold plating cases. They used capped gold cases that would have stainless steel case backs. They did some interesting watch, I don't want to say collaborations, that's really the wrong term, but they made some watches that were really in partnership with Movado. Some of the styling cues were a lot the same. You can see that classic dot at the 12 o'clock on some of the vintage Zenith models, as well as they had other brands that they would kind of shop out their movements or produce the watches for, companies like Concord that didn't do too well. But this was something of the times. A lot of brands did it, but Zenith did it, and they're probably one of the more prestigious brands, I guess you would say, that actually were guilty of doing kind of that type of thing for the time. So they kind of, if you've been in the watch collecting community a long time, and most people that are really not open to new watch brands and models and things like that, quote unquote, the snobs, they really kind of remember this, and so they might not have caught on to what Zenith is doing today, which is a lot of really cool and great things, not only bringing back aesthetics from some of their vintage watches, but also coming out with new models that some really love and enjoy, especially die-hard collectors. I really think Zenith's doing a really good thing out there, and I do believe that in the coming years we'll see Zenith watches dry up a little bit in the market as more people just see the value that's available from really an iconic manufacturer at this point that's really turned things around and I'm doing some pretty great things. Next, we have Grand Seiko. Now, in recent times, the last 5 years, as Grand Seiko has entered the US market, spent so much in marketing and distribution and authorized dealers and partnerships, things have come a long way. But I remember even 5, 6, 7 years ago, upwards of 10 years ago, when Grand Seiko was really not in the US market like you see today, if at all, depending on which point in time. Grand Seiko is really for the more nuanced collector that wanted to spend the time research and really did not care about branding, but only cared about the mechanics behind it. And in watches today, setting aside Grand Seiko, there are so many brands that do really great job with not only their movements, but production, manufacturing, and so many other aspects and components of their business. But Grand Seiko certainly was one that was completely overlooked. I don't want to say it's because of where it's made in the world, but that was a component of it, right? It was produced in Asia largely, and there was a period of time where that was kind of looked down upon. Now, things have changed drastically, and that's not the case, but if we're talking about someone that's been watch collecting for, let's say, 60 years, this may just not have been something that they were willing to accept, right? I mean, you have watchmakers all over the world that are doing really great things. Obviously in Asia, but also you have Germany, which some, Swiss purists also say, hey, that's not for me. And so that is a factor that comes into play. It's kind of like someone that says, I only drive German automobiles, even though the parts are all coming from different places, but you get it. And when we're talking about that kind of a watch snob person, they might be willing or not willing, rather, to accept watches that are made in different parts of the world. I think that's crazy because I do believe that Grand Seiko provides some of the best value watches, and the quality and care and attention to detail is really unparalleled at the price point. Now, Grand Seiko has started bumping up their retail prices, and their secondhand prices are, tying closer to the retail price when they trade out there than what they once were, and that's just a function of desirability. And so I think going into the future, we'll see more people kind of jump on the bandwagon, not in a negative way, but more people that maybe are considered purists or snobs are going to start really believing in the brand, what they do, and the prices are going to come up because of it. But if that's what it takes to get people into, appreciating other things that maybe they overlook, that's just part of the game. That is part of, we're talking about luxury goods after all. So these things are going to come with price tags at the end of the day. Next, Omega. Now, this is also changing as well, but you get a lot of, Rolex purists, people that really love the Rolex brand that sometimes will say, hey, Omega just wants to be Rolex. I mean, I'm wearing a Rolex now, but I don't believe that's the case because I also own Omega, and I've done videos where I compare Omega Seamaster to Rolex Submariner, and setting aside branding, they do a really amazing job today. Now, I want to say decades ago, maybe Omega had a bit of a rough patch, much like Zenith did. I don't want to say that they watered down the brand entirely, but there was a period of time where Omega watches are not what they were today, before they kind of went on that streak after the Omega Seamaster, the James Bond, the blue wave dial that we all know and love, and now they've kind of revitalized it. It's probably the hottest watch out there that you can actually purchase if you try. Omega has really come a long way. Think of the time period when Omega was really focused on like the DeVilles and the Dynamics and the Dynamic Chronograph, now become cult classic, but they just didn't really sell very well back then. And so once again, people that have been watch collecting a very long time, decades and decades, they kind of sometimes have a bit of that idea in their head of, hey, Omega is just trying to be Rolex. But I think we're pretty close, if not already here, to where, the time has come where, setting aside that branding out there in the market, but certainly among watch collectors that know the specs, want to do their homework, research, and get a really great fine product, great timekeeping device, they're really there with Rolex, in my opinion. They've really arrived. What do you guys think? Rolex Omega, age-old debate. Leave that one in the comments below. Can't wait to hear the Omega and Rolex debates. It's always a fun one in the comments, guys. And lastly, this is a brand that I don't really like in general, but I can appreciate, and I do like some of the models. This is going to be an Hublot. I think when we're talking about those that really only look at the old world brands, Hublot is often looked down upon, even outside of the watch snobs, just in watch collecting community in general. And I think this is because Hublot had once again, they're a newer brand. I want to say that they came out in the late 80s, moved into the 90s, really became popular in early 2000, and then kind of died off, but not in some markets. They still do very well in Latin America, in parts of Europe, Eastern Europe, where they have really great marketing presence. But there was this period of time, this long period of time, where they had a lot of products in their catalog that used quartz movements, and that kind of became, looked down upon by a lot of watch collectors and snobs and purists. But also, they didn't do a great job at decorating their movements for a while, commensurate with the price point and what their competitors were doing. I mean, Hublots were always kind of pricier watches with the, there were some exceptions earlier on, like the earlier classic fusions, but those prices quickly jumped as well. And there was just this pretty long period of time of maybe even upwards of 7 years where Hublot just really didn't focus on the mechanics because they didn't have to, right? They had Jay-Z, they had Beyonce's, the Kanye West, all of these celebrities that just love wearing the watches. So it was like, hey, why are we going to do this? Leave that up to A. Longonzona, leave that up to Patek Philippe. We don't need to do the movements thing. But as watches became more of a hobby, a passion, this collecting community emerged, Hublot really turned things around. And now that, they do, depending on the model, do a pretty great job at the watches they're producing. Now, it still has that original aesthetic and feel of the brand, right? The large, chunky, clunky watches that oftentimes give collectors and snobs, a bit of a bad taste as well. But setting that aside, many people really enjoy and love these watches. Personally, I really like the way that the spirit of the Big Bang looks. I think it's pretty cool. It uses a Zenith movement, right? The El Primero. That being said, you can get a very comparable watch from Zenith for a fraction of the price, but it's just something different, right? In watches, watch collecting, we all like things a little bit different. And, these things that I'm sharing with you, these stories, these anecdotes about these brands, it's not going to be universal, right? There may be someone that just loves, the purest of watch brands out there, the Patek Philippe's, the A. Longonzonas, these, the Breguets for that matter. They just love these kind of classic brands, but maybe they have an Hublot in their collection. So this is not cookie cutter 100%. These are just things that I've found talking with fellow collectors, with so many customers, delraywatch.com, where so many people call us with these interesting stories or send me messages on Instagram, The Real John P. So these are just things I've picked up, heard from other dealers, talked with collectors like you, and it's not cookie cutter. So, in no way do I mean to say, hey, there's never going to be someone that appreciates great watches that will add a Grand Seiko to their collection or anything like that, because things change. Everything out there is fluid, just things I've noticed and wanted to share with you. But what do you guys think? Are there any other brands that maybe were not, attractive to purists or snobs previously but now are? I would love to hear this in the comments below. Please do not forget the thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, guys, have a great week. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.